And so as we begin this expanded policy role, I mean, and we've always been in this space a bit with really rich and vital partnerships with HUD, with the VA, with usage. We're building on those very strong and vital relationships. And we're thrilled, for instance, that today the sitting secretary of HUD, Marsha Fudge, is joining us to talk about her focus on homelessness. And we'll be joined by our former Community Solutions colleague, our beloved Tamara Wright, who's now at usage and is one of the leaders there of the development of the new National Strategic Plan on Homelessness. But we also are forming new partnerships because we know that in this world of clearing the path to making it normative to be ending homelessness, to reaching functional zero, we're going to need mayors and county executives, for example, to play much enhanced roles as sources of accountability locally for getting the job done. And so we have a new partnership with the Boston University Initiative on Cities, and in particular, their Menino Survey of mayors that you'll be hearing about, that will set the stage for the kind of learning and growing relationships that we know we're going to need to get the job done over the next 5 years. And so I'm going to ask Garen to turn to our policy pillars and our priorities to sort of set the stage for what you'll hear about from Ali and Andrea first, and then from Bethany. So, and taking on this expanded policy function within the organization, we've identified these 5 areas that as Built for Zero leaders, you'll know really represent kind of our collective point of view that first of all, we need a new and focused and integrated and clear federal interagency goal and a measurement framework for ending homelessness. We need to see federal funding actually reinforcing the goal of population level reductions in homelessness and making it clear that functional zero is the end state that makes sense as the end state of federal policy. Second, we've learned together that without quality real-time data, without a comprehensive understanding of this dynamic problem of what's working, it can't solve a problem you can't understand. And you also can't understand its racially inequitable dimensions without quality data. And so making this the new standard of practice is a policy priority for our team. And then we're all committed to finishing the job of ending veteran homelessness. So much progress has been made, but the job is far from done. And we know what works, and we have a sense collectively of what some of the principal barriers are that we need to tackle together. Also, we've certainly seen even before COVID that homelessness, it's time that we understood it differently as an urgent and solvable public health and racial equity crisis. And that the tools of public health, even before COVID, reminded us all painfully of the need for collaboration, for knowing in real time what's happening, of iterating as a problem moves and changes, that it's time as we think about how the country rebuilds its public health infrastructure post-COVID to actually integrate homelessness, healthcare, public health, and the skills, even the people who work on these problems as part of a blended team and part of a same mindset about how communities solve homelessness through the lens of a public health and collective accountability model. And then lastly, ending homelessness in rural America and in tribal communities, we think has been too long neglected, that these communities really struggle with even having the local institutional capacity to know what's going on, where in communities where homelessness looks very different. And in fact, some of our definitions that make sense in urban areas may need to be re-examined. And so we have really been enriched by a great team of our Built for Zero rural community leaders and tribal leaders in thinking through what this could look like and must look like as we move ahead. And so within that frame, I'm going to be turning this over now to Elise and to Andrea Stanley to give you a sense of what specifically we have been working on most recently and set the stage for some of the specific initiatives that we want you to be aware of and frankly want you to be deeply engaged with. And Bethany's going to be speaking to that later. So Ali and Andrea.
Thanks so much, Roseanne. Hi, everybody. My name is Elise, and I've had the pleasure of working with Community Solutions, and I'm really looking forward to getting to know more of you in the community. And I'm joined with Andrea. I can't see you, but I know you're on here, Andrea, and I'll turn it over to you in a few moments. But we are at a really, first of all, thank you, Rosanne. Thanks for setting the stage and for the frame, as all of you who are working in the trenches every day, and seeing firsthand the challenges, and then sort of circling back to the news, sadly seeing our policymakers still trying to rifle through what's the best way to move forward an aggressive agenda. And, the reason that I thought I would start by just sort of setting the stage for the context of the federal policy, which is where we're going to spend, I think, the next few minutes really focusing on our federal policy pillars as Rosanne laid them out. I think, I just wanted to set the stage for where we are in terms of the current reconciliation bill that many have heard about, the president's Build Back Better framework that was released last week, and why your voices are so essential to helping us as we both expand the team and the capacity within the organization to help really shine a bright light on these policy areas that we need both additional resources for and support upon. And we've been working behind the scenes with key congressional offices where we've got Built for Zero communities on the ground. And one of the things that, I know as somebody that's been working on housing policy for the greater part of my career is there's a lot of great advocacy organizations. We partner with many of them who are, helping to raise awareness and promote positive policy-based solutions that are really practitioner-led, right? So learning from the ground up to inform what are the kinds of solutions. Too often in Washington, we often put together policy recommendations that aren't really tested or haven't been fully baked from an implementation standpoint at the community level. And I think that's one of the joys that I have in working with this organization is that we spend a lot of time in listening sessions and hearing directly from you regarding what some of those needs are. So Andrea will go into some detail about some of the specific policy recommendations that we've been advancing throughout this process. We are still unclear about the timing of this large reconciliation bill that is before Congress as we speak. We have, included and have been advocating for some of these specific proposals, which Andrea will walk you through. And I guess I would just say, amongst all the chaos of busy times with competing priorities, we think it's really essential, and we'll hear later from Secretary Fudge about the fact that ending homelessness is, really right at the heart of what one of the key priorities that the president and the secretary and multiple agencies are starting to really move forward and put at the center of the agenda. And so our work will be to support those efforts, to bring about new ideas and recommendations, and to work through the reconciliation process, which includes the infrastructure provisions and also looking at kind of traditional appropriations and other ways that the federal government funds the work that we're doing, as Rosanne laid out, in terms of really making the connection between the public health and homelessness crisis that we have across the country. So maybe, Andrea, I'll turn it to you to walk through some of the specific recommendations, and then I can answer any detailed questions with respect to our kind of implementation plans.
Yeah, I think we might hold off on questions to Leanne unless we have a little bit extra time on the schedule, because I know we need to get to Secretary Fudge. But as Rosanne and Ali mentioned, I'm Andrea. I'm the Senior Research and Policy Analyst here at Community Solutions on our nascent policy team. And I just wanted to talk you through three recommendations or things that proposals we were advocating for during the reconciliation process, which unfortunately didn't make it into the most recent bill that was released last week. But as I'm sure all of you are aware, many of the housing provisions that had been in the original proposal by the House Financial Services Committee didn't make it. So I want to frame this conversation as this is what we were advocating for this round of funding, but we think that these are policy priorities that we want to carry forward and continue to advocate for, whether it's other lanes like appropriations, which is about to come up, or whether it's taking an administrative route. We think that these are programs and ideas that really add a lot of value to the current system. So the first one would be a systems improvement manager. I'm sure you all know that communities need dedicated and experienced data process and systems improvement leaders. And this would add FTEs to each COC who would be accountable for meeting systems performance measures and longitudinal systems analyses, and would be accountable to population level reductions in homelessness. They'd be empowered to use data to drive these outcomes. And unlike a staff member whose primary role is supporting programmatic or compliance goals, these individuals would be responsible for coordinating system-wide efforts to achieve reductions in homelessness across the entire COC. For example, we know that there's an influx of state and local fiscal recovery funds, of home art funds, of EHB money, and like a good use of what we see a system improvement manager doing is kind of coordinating with these outside agencies, outside government entities, so that everyone can be working to the shared aim of reducing, of making population level reductions in homelessness. And because we acknowledge that many COCs can struggle to attract talent with the skills and experience to do this kind of data and technology based job, then the allocation we asked for was roughly $150,000 a year for one system improvement manager per COC to be available. I'm going to skip around a little bit because we do have another slide coming, and talk about a different capacity building ask that we had, which is around rural COCs. I'm sure that Mary's on this call. Mary Simons is on this call as well, who helped influence this policy. Really, we know that rural homelessness and homelessness in tribal communities doesn't look like homelessness experienced in metropolitan areas where most of the policy setting occurs, because homelessness is out of sight and there's either a recognition gap or a definition gap that can exist between the person experiencing homelessness and the service provider. We would like to put more capacity in either COCs that are largely rural or COCs that contain largely rural areas, in order to kind of meet people where they are. A person who would be responsible for outreach and service delivery. The total amount of the ask averaged out to about, if it was fully utilized, one FTE per every 4 counties. And I understand that a county might not be the best metric because, California doesn't have that many counties, but Kentucky does. So I understand there's some like geographic distributions, but roughly it would be about 1 for every 4 county. And we wanted to make sure that there was staff who was dedicated to making sure that we were reaching people experiencing homelessness in rural and tribal areas and responsible for those geographies, and we could target that population. The third policy proposal we had for reconciliation was an ask around GPD, which I know there were some conversations in the chat about the VA's grant per diem program. The goal would be to make sure that the current transitional housing that is maybe not being utilized fully could be transferred into permanent supportive housing. Resources to enable the conversion of these GPD facilities, because we know that the program can evolve, and we want to ensure that the funding is going to meet the needs that are occurring in the community. And for some communities, that is a need for permanent supportive housing rather than transitional beds. If you wanted to go to the next slide. So in a broader sense, other than the 3 specific asks that we had in reconciliation that we will be adapting and moving forward, and I'll also just note that there was a monetary ask, a funding ask to the GPD transition, but that's because anything in reconciliation has to have a funding ask, but we would actually detach it from any additional funding moving forward in the proposal, is that we want to answer the question of how we might better align HUD's grant making and reporting requirements to drive more useful, comprehensive data for communities. Everyone here knows that communities need real-time by name data because it helps to understand the effectiveness of interventions, optimize existing resources, understand where new approaches and investments can have the largest impact, map those resources, and understand racial disparities. And funding requirements have proven in the past to rapidly drive change within the HMIS system. So we as a policy team are moving to push the idea that federal funding should establish this data standard and support technology innovation. This direction focuses on influencing, leveraging these funding requirements to drive data quality and systems integration. Next slide. And just a little bit more. And just a little bit more about grant per diems. That's why I skipped around a little bit. We have been working as part of a coalition, and my colleague Leslie Wise has been largely leading the coalition work. And with US Vets, with Volunteers for America, and with the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans, supported by the Home Depot Foundation, to kind of look what right sizing the grant per diem program looks like. We understand that GPD was established with an understanding that veterans need support in the communities where they live, and that offering that support is critical. But as the number of actively homeless veterans continues to decrease, and as we do a better job of preventing inflow into veteran homelessness, we expect that program occupancy will decrease in certain communities, which will kind of create opportunities to repurpose those resources to match the needs. And one way to do that is we can respond by enabling GPD operators to repurpose their excess resources to help even more veterans actually exit homelessness and be placed in permanent supportive housing and achieve housing stability as quickly as possible. And we could allow GPD operators to right size their transitional housing to enable them to meet the reduced demand while shifting resources to supporting housing stability and permanent housing. And to take full advantage of these opportunities, we would need, GPD operators would need flexibility to switch between models as needed. And that's something that we are looking to, that's a policy pathway we are also pursuing. That is similar to what we offered in reconciliation, but is kind of a broader kind of change of thinking and change of the way people think about GPD and permanent supportive housing. And that,
we can pause there. We have a few minutes to take questions from folks who have any questions about our policy pillars that we just reviewed and our reconciliation and other federal proposals. So we have about 7 minutes until we jump into our next speaker. So feel free to jump on.
And while questions are coming in, Bethany, if I may, I think it's going to be really important as we begin to expand our work. We will be reaching out to you. We've been engaging with members of Congress over the last 3 months to look for opportunities for testimony. And some of the best way to do that is to identify people in the field that are working on these issues every day. So we hope to expand that work and be reaching out to each of you. We're looking for best practices and models that can be that are happening at state and local levels that can be leveraged and potentially turned into federal models. And we continue to work in partnership with some of the organizations that Andrea mentioned, but others as well who are, continuing to support traditional homelessness funding and those programs. But these are areas where we think we have a unique opportunity to weigh in and look at systems change work.
Allie and Andrea, one of the questions that came in was, is the VA in support of the GPD proposal?
So I will just say that we are in the very early stages of mapping out what the exact language of the GPD proposal would look like with our coalition partners. And we want to get as much stakeholder alignment as we can in this area before we start having conversations with the VA. But the VA has been open and responsive to having those conversations when we are ready.
Yeah, I think that's right. And just as an add-on to that, I will say Rosanne has been an incredible resource during the transition of this administration. And we've established a nice rapport, as well as the ongoing Built for Zero community that works on a regular basis with the team at the VA that kind of has the responsibility of implementing these programs. And so, the question often is, what's the best vehicle to get at some of these changes? And I would say, we have had the support and engagement of the appropriate VA staff to get us the information we need. And hopefully we'll be working on a proposal that can be endorsed by the administration as well, that we can move forward on.
The next question we had was about if anyone audits the GPD program. I'm not sure if we have that level of information. I believe, Tyra, that's what you were referring to, was auditing the payments to GPD providers.
We can look into that. I don't know that we have the answer to that right now, but there certainly is, and there may have well been some GA oversight over the GPD program, but I think we've seen news reports around overpayments and those types of things. And by the way, if you are, seeing or hearing about those kinds of experiences on the ground, we'd love to, hear about them. Any of those kind of in real time issues that are coming up, whether they relate to overpayment or challenges, we have, and I should have said this at the start, we've got millions and millions of new resources coming in, from COVID relief dollars to this reconciliation package. And you guys are the eyes and ears that we need on the ground to know what's working and where, if we need to make corrective action to change some of these programs. So we can follow back up with you offline regarding the GPD oversight with respect to overpayment issues.
We just have some discussion going on in the chat around the GPD program. Does anyone have any other questions for our policy team before we move into some of our other work? I also posted an action alert in the chat. We are starting to get engaged in federal level advocacy. And so this is just our dipping our toe in the water. So feel free to take action, personalize your letter, but you'll be seeing over the next few months, the policy team will be engaging more and more with our Built for Zero communities, and looking forward to doing that. I know that our next speaker, Kate, is on the line. So I think we can just move to our next presentation. And I will be introducing our speaker. Hello, let me close this out. So the 2021 Menino Survey of Mayors represents the 8th nationally representative survey of American mayors, and it's based on interviews with 126 sitting mayors from 39 states. The 2021 survey explores mayors' views on COVID-19 recovery, equity, and small business, closing the racial wealth gap, and housing and homelessness. This survey continues each year with the support of Citi and the Rockefeller Foundation. Earlier this year, Community Solutions partnered with the Menino Survey of Mayors to include a set of questions about how mayors are thinking about homelessness and their perceived solutions. This second set of findings that we're so excited to unveil will be released in full in January of 2022. And it delves into the local policy of homelessness, including mayoral perspectives on coordination and data challenges and measurement of success. So this will provide us with baseline information that we will use as we gauge our work with mayors over the next few years. But we won't be able to make this progress without your help. And so you'll be seeing more from us, as I mentioned before, seeing more advocacy, education, training, and opportunities heading into this next year. So now we're excited to hear from Katie Einstein, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at Boston University, who will be providing us with a quick preview of the results. Thank you, Katie. You can advance, Garen.
Thank you so much for having me here to present this work. I am so excited to get to share some of our preliminary results. Next slide. So the Menino Survey of Mayors, as Bethany really helpfully introduced, is conducted with BU's Initiative on Cities. So I'm one of the principal investigators of the survey, along with my amazing Boston University colleagues, David Glick and Max Palmer. And we have been doing this now for almost a decade. And so we've asked mayors all sorts of questions, ranging from things on racial equity to housing construction to small business, and this year, homelessness. One of the things that makes this survey really distinctive is that we conduct live interviews, either in person or over the phone with mayors. So we're not talking with their chiefs of staff or policy advisors. We are speaking with the mayors themselves. And we focus on cities over 75,000. So we get mayors from mid-sized and large cities to talk with us about a variety of different policy areas. And so again, this survey from this year covered a wide variety of topics. So this doesn't just select for mayors who are really excited about homelessness. And we featured a variety of open and closed-ended questions. And one of the really exciting things about the Menino survey is that because we do these live interviews, we're able to get elaborations from mayors about sort of the different responses to their closed-ended questions. Next slide. So why talk to mayors about homelessness, right? So a lot of really important decisions about local government policy or about homelessness policy are made by local governments, right? So local leaders make decisions about how much new housing gets built and where it gets built. They make decisions about whether government is going to pursue punitive or harm reduction policy. And they also make really consequential decisions about how and where homelessness policy gets administered. And some of our results from this year will really help to illuminate some of the variations in how mayors pursue these policies. And so this year, we asked broad questions about the politics of homelessness and some of the important obstacles that mayors are facing to addressing homelessness. We asked them about policy implementation, and then we asked them about data and how they're using data to address homelessness, and what are the key challenges they're facing in getting access to high quality data. Next slide. So here you can see we asked mayors just a simple question about how accountability and homelessness. So we asked them how much their residents hold them accountable for addressing homelessness and how much control they have over addressing homelessness in their city. And you can see there's a really big gap in how they perceive these issues. So they believe a strong majority of them think that their constituents hold them accountable for addressing homelessness, but many of them feel that they lack the tools to really manage this challenge in their cities, that they only have at best a moderate amount of control over homelessness in their cities. Next slide. So we also asked mayors about what major obstacles they face for to reducing homelessness. And I circle here the most popular and one that we've been hearing a lot about today already in this session, this really important issue of limited funding, that mayors see themselves as really financially constrained from being able to address homelessness and reduce homelessness in their city. They also cite public opposition to new housing and shelters and limited human and social services as major obstacles. Roughly half of them also cite a lack of quality data for decision making, and a majority also mention, and this is going to come up in the data as well, sort of their concerns about quality data, a lack of coordination between government and social service agencies. So those are really some of the key obstacles that our local leaders are concerned about. Next slide. So one of the things, that I, as someone who studied local government, one of the features of local government that continually shocks me is how little data we have about how governments at the local level administer really basic programs. So just to start with, we asked mayors an open-ended question to get at this really important question of policy implementation in homelessness. So we asked mayors, does your city government have staff that is dedicated to the needs of persons experiencing homelessness? And if so, what is their title or department? So it's an open-ended question that we then went through and coded. And first I flagged that almost 30% of mayors have no one in their cities who are explicitly devoted to the needs of people experiencing homelessness. So that's a large number of pretty big cities that don't really have city staff whose job it is to focus on this important policy area. Perhaps unsurprisingly, a plurality of mayors house their sort of homelessness policy within their social services, and a large number also house it within their housing departments. But one that was really striking to me, and potentially suggests some, problems with how we're administering our homelessness policy, is that a fifth of mayors have police officers who are expressly devoted to the needs of people experiencing homelessness. And this could potentially be problematic if we are tasking harm reduction policies to police officers. And along with my colleague, Dr. Charlie Willison, who is at Cornell University, we're actually exploring this further, looking at what happens when we try to implement harm reduction policies through police departments. But the police are really important implementers of homelessness policy. That was an important finding from this research. Next slide. So again, just underscoring what I think is an underappreciated role of the police in homelessness policy, we asked mayors, how much do each of the following groups shape your city's homelessness policies? And again, a strong majority of mayors see the police as either having some or a lot of influence over cities' homelessness policies. Other groups that are highly influential include the local nonprofit community, continuums of care, people at risk of experiencing homelessness, and public housing authorities and local departments of public health. Next slide. So again, when we think about coordination challenges, right? One of the things that we sort of came to light in our data, we asked an open-ended question about obstacles to collecting and using high-quality data. So we really wanted to get a sense of what kinds of data mayors were using to measure homelessness, and sort of what challenges they encountered. And mayors highlighted coordination challenges with their counties, with surrounding local governments, and with nonprofits. Next slide. So starting with counties and surrounding local governments, one of the things that stood out on this year's Menino survey is a lot of mayors have really troubled relationships with their county governments, which is not surprising, right? We generally know that fragmentation in local governments can hinder communication. We also know that sort of one of the, there's often a partisan mismatch between county governments and local governments, which can sort of further create challenges, right? But a lot of mayors highlighted the fact that the county either didn't share data or didn't collect it in the way they wanted to. And again, this is more generally a really big problem. In this year's Menino survey, we heard about mayors who couldn't get access to like vaccine data from their counties or COVID-19 data from their counties. So this is not just a problem that's limited to homelessness, but it is an important obstacle in this area. Next slide. Right. There also were challenges with sort of working with a variety of members of the nonprofit sector. So a lot of mayors suggested that different shelters and different nonprofits in their community didn't always agree about how to collect data or coordinate services. Or in one case, there were just shelters that weren't even sharing data with the city. And so again, this is really challenging for cities because they have to coordinate with surrounding local governments and with private sector entities as well. Next slide. So we also asked mayors how they define success in addressing homelessness. And again, this was a really open-ended question. And I think the first thing that I want to flag is, one of the joys of doing these surveys in person is you can tell when mayors have like an answer at the ready, when they're like, here's the 6 metrics that I use. And when they're sort of really, this isn't something that's top of head for them. And what we observed in the answer to this question was that a lot of mayors didn't really have an answer at the top of their head. They had to stop and really think about it. And so I think this is a place where local leaders could really use guidance in thinking about how to define success in addressing homelessness. So as we coded responses, 60% of mayors actually didn't highlight a reduction goal at all. So they talked about things like providing better social services, providing better support, providing better mental health support, right? But they didn't explicitly mention a goal of reducing homelessness. We also generally coded the different sort of policy areas that mayors thought about when they thought about success in addressing homelessness. And a plurality of mayors really centered their responses on housing. Some of them also mentioned social services. A striking 10% of mayors actually highlighted what we call externalities. So essentially they said, I define success if I no longer get complaints from my community residents about homelessness, or I define success if my business community is happy, or I define success if I don't, see litter on the street from homeless people. So there were, again, this is a minority of mayors, but a striking number who thought about success and homelessness in those terms. Another 10% also highlighted success in terms of coordination. Next slide. So just to summarize our results, we think that local governments are really critical partners in reducing homelessness. And so understanding the views of mayors and local leaders is critical to really implementing effective homelessness policy. We find that mayors are often left without the staff, data, and financial tools they need to address key challenges, and that they frequently resort to police as policy implementers in this space, even those mayors who are committed to harm reduction as a primary policy goal. We also find that intergovernmental coordination is a significant challenge, and that mayors need better data and clear measurement standards for success. So thank you, and I look forward to questions or comments that folks have about this.
Thank you, Catherine. We do have a couple comments and questions in the chat that I'll get to. And these will be ones that luckily we've already asked you, so I know you know the answer. Can you differentiate the mayor's data based on governance structures? We talked about this, a mayor council, city manager form versus the mayor's council led government.
Yes, so we always check for that, and we have those data available. I've always been shocked in studying, we run that, we run that crosstab basically every year. We're like, this is going to be the year where we find a big difference between cities that have strong mayors versus council manager systems. And we don't actually find huge differences typically. So in the final report, we'll include those results, and there may be some places where they differ a bit. But by and large, just in my experience of having done this for nearly a decade, there's actually surprisingly little difference in the attitudes, which again, it's really surprising to me given the difference in institutional powers those mayors have.
Thank you. And then someone else was asking about how many mayors were in Built for Zero communities. And I think we had 18% were from Built for Zero communities. So I do want to say in relationship, I'm sorry, I should have said this, to the strong mayor versus weak mayor model. I think it's interesting that maybe the mayors didn't perceive difference, but I wonder if it will have implications for our advocacy strategies. So not to think that it doesn't have any bearing on how we will just figure out how to advocate.
Oh, totally. Yeah, just to clarify, their attitudes may be quite similar, but obviously their powers and what policies may work best for each type of mayor could be quite different. So yeah, I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, thank you. Someone asked if the report is available. It will be available in January 2022 when we launch it, and you will be the first to know. So check your inboxes. And we'll be holding a press conference, and we'll invite you to watch that. Someone said would be interested in a crosstab report on answers from mayors who rely on COCs to help guide policy.
Yeah, that's definitely something we're going to look into. And actually, one really exciting thing, so my collaborator on this particular module is Dr. Charlie Willison, who's a public health and political scientist over at Cornell University. She runs a survey of COCs. And so we're actually in this report going to use some of the data from that survey of COCs to sort of get a real sense. And one of the things that really was striking to us is how similar the responses to some of these questions were when we asked similar questions of mayors and COCs. But we will also do a crosstab to look at sort of how mayors who are responding, who get their information from COCs, sort of think about these issues.
Great. I just want to remind everyone, we do have until about until a half past. So we have plenty of times. We're making great time. Another question we had is from a former mayoral staff. Is there any sort of collaborative for mayor staff to interact? And this is something that we are definitely pursuing at Community Solutions, that we'll be asking for your support, is thinking about what are the best ways to work with mayors, share this information with mayors. We also are working in partnership with some national organizations of mayors, like the United States Conference of Mayors, for example, or the National League of Cities, and working through their networks as well to get this information out. But we'll be seeking that kind of support from you as well, Eric. And we'd love to know that you're a former mayoral staff. I noted that. All right. Last one, sorry, that really eye-opening. Do you track longitudinal data for individual mayors over time? Curious how some of these measures evolve with tenure in their role.
So we do ask some questions repeatedly over time. One of the sort of interesting things about running an elite survey is we have to be careful not to bore the mayors. We always want the survey to be interesting and new because we do have some of the same folks each year. And so we tend not to ask like repeat questions every year, but we do ask certain sets of questions every 2 years. This is actually our first year, though, asking a set of questions about homelessness. We are hoping in partnership with Community Solutions to repeat some of these questions and ask additional questions about homelessness again in 2 years. And so I think that might be a really exciting opportunity to look at whether, if we have the same cities or even the same mayors, to look at whether they evolve on some of these issues, perhaps in response to policy interventions.
Great. We have another question. People are very excited about this, which is great. Do you have data on the discrepancies between what mayors say and what their policies look like? I'm sure you get this a lot. So they said, for example, the mayor of Denver would likely answer these questions well, cite reducing homelessness as a policy goal. However, the actual policies in Denver are extremely detrimental to the unhoused community.
This is such a good question. So we do track it. We've done this on some areas. So we did this actually in an academic paper a few years ago that looked at sort of how much mayors who say they care about racial equity actually do a lot on racial equity. And there does look like there's some correspondence. So I think on some policy areas where there's a high social desirability bias, like saying you care about racial equity, you might get mayors sort of exaggerating their sort of interest in tackling those challenging issues. But one thing that we think is a real strength methodologically of this survey is participation in the survey is anonymous, as are the responses. And so we actually think that mayors can get really frank with us. And there are a few who will give us like their pat campaign speech answers, but I actually say for the most part, they will be quite honest with us and will often say things like, oh, is this going to be anonymous, before they tell us like whatever sort of conflict they're experiencing in their city. So I do think we get an unusual level of honesty, certainly more than what you might get by analyzing like campaign speeches or public statements.
That's great. That's the end of the questions in the chat. We do have folks who want to read that paper, so I'll follow up with you afterwards to get a link to that. Yeah, are there any other questions we have? This has been really fascinating information. And like I said, Community Solutions is really eager to dive in and use this to work with you as we work with mayors. Do any of you have any other questions as folks who are embedded in this work, who are working with your local governments already? Oh, would Katie suggest questions that community leaders can ask their mayors?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's such a good question. So I think maybe, what might be helpful is to me, what was really interesting here, and something that I certainly would like to unpack in sort of future iterations of the Menino survey, would be to better understand public opposition and what sort of community support mayors feel like they need to get homelessness policies passed. Because clearly, this came across both in the open-ended and closed-ended responses. Mayors see public opposition to policies addressing homelessness, and frankly, public opposition to homeless people, right? Like there's this real anti-homelessness bias that sort of permeates a lot of American urban public discourse. Sort of what do mayors think would be most effective for getting around this? What kinds of advocacy organization support is needed to counteract those really problematic dynamics in public meetings?
And to that as well, over the next, as I mentioned this several times, but as we head into 2022, Community Solutions will be creating resources and materials and trainings and guidance on how to do this work, how to work with your communities. We have a small pilot going with a few Built for Zero communities who, if you're on this call, feel free to chime in, talking about what are those barriers if your COC is part of the county. How does that impact do you have more access to these folks than if you're a private nonprofit or less? And just trying to figure out what are those different pressure points and strengths and weaknesses each COC has when engaging with their local electeds. So we're hoping to learn from them as well. We'll have that out at the end of the year. And then use that as a basis. And if folks are interested in this type of work and are really ginned up to talk to your local electeds, please reach out to me, Bethany Snyder. You can find me on our website with my email. I'll put it in the chat when I'm done talking. And we'd love to hear, but we also want to make sure that we're also going to make sure that we're being strategic and reaching out to communities that we know where we can move the needle as well. So we're looking for proactive and reactive engagement on this. Someone asked, has anyone done an educational campaign to help end the stigma and NIMBYism around experiencing homelessness? This might not just be for Catherine, but if you have that, or have you heard about that?
Yeah, so I'm really excited by this in the next question, because in my other hat as a researcher, I studied public opposition to housing and land use regulation. So I am somewhat well equipped to answer these, not necessarily from the Menino survey, but just from my other research. In answer, it looks like there are some folks who've run educational campaigns. And so I'm really eager actually to hear about some of the results of this, because one of the things that we've seen in a lot of survey work and community outreach work around sort of getting more support for affordable housing and supportive housing is that it is incredibly hard to do, that people are really recalcitrant around it, and it takes really creative and targeted policy solutions. If there are other folks in the Zoom room who have ideas in this, I'd actually love to hear more about what some of the other approaches have been.
And then there was folks are talking about in the chat about the land use issues, and it was brought up way earlier when you first started talking about the disconnect between land use issues and affordable housing and homelessness.
Yeah. So I think when we think about our land use regulations and zoning, we make it so hard to build just like any kind of housing in cities, right? And one of the particular features of land use regulations in most American cities is they empower community opposition and a very small group of vocal opponents to stop sort of things that they don't want being built near them. And so that creates just huge obstacles to building public housing, affordable housing, shelters, right? We have set it up so that there are these public hearings that can attract 20 angry neighbors. And those hearings end up holding more sway over public officials compared to sort of the greater needs of the broader community. So that is a huge issue in a lot of cities, and that the institutional structures really favor the political interests of that vocal minority who is deeply opposed to something being built near them.
We had another question about, is there a version of this type of survey for the PHAs, the public housing authorities?
Not that I know about, but I would be super interested if someone was running that. I'd be curious to know their views on this. Yeah, I see someone saying it doesn't have to be tagged as affordable. It can just be an apartment of more than 2 units. And that's actually exactly what our research shows, is that opposition is just as fierce if you're saying you're going to build like a market rate townhouse as compared to big affordable developments. That getting people to accept community change in general is really, really hard. And then it gets even harder when you start talking about affordable, subsidized or, supportive housing.
And Allie jumped in and said there is funding to address zoning barriers and the reconciliation bill as well. So we'll see more coming out about that. Excellent. We have just like a couple more minutes, then we can have a short break before we hear from Secretary Fudge. Oh, excellent. We have one. I'm taking down people's names in a notes if you say that you're interested. So you'll be hearing from me. So, and I'll also be putting my information in the chat when I'm done with this. Oh, so here, can you talk a little more about what you think could counter the vocal minority economic elite issue?
Yeah, so this is actually the subject of some other research that I've been doing with some of my BU colleagues, really thinking about what are community outreach strategies that could actually get sort of more supportive voices in the room. And so there's some places that are pursuing really interesting equitable community engagement. So some places are using things like equitable focus groups, where rather than just having a community meeting where like the angriest people show up, you explicitly reach out to renters, people who are living in affordable housing developments, people who are, BIPOC people, young people, like basically all the folks who are underrepresented. And what we found when we analyzed those equitable focus groups is really heartening, was that when people were in a room with sort of other folks who were renters or who lived in subsidized housing, they were much more supportive of changing zoning to allow for higher density housing. And they even explicitly said, I felt scared to say this at a normal public meeting when all the angry voices started kicking into gear, but I felt much more comfortable saying this in this forum. So, I think there's some approaches that we could use, anything that moves us away from the angry crowd in like the senior center or the local government building, where the same voices are yelling over and over again about housing, and thinking about how can we meet underrepresented communities where they are, what kinds of outreach can we do to get to them. But that was sort of my optimistic take. Unfortunately, the pessimistic take is anytime we engage in equity-oriented local political processes, there's a backlash. And so the communities that have done these kinds of sort of more courageous community engagement approaches have absolutely faced sort of significant backlash as a consequence.
I think this also underscores what I have found doing advocacy on lots of different issues, some of them very controversial over the last 20 years, is that this really underscores the relationship you can build with your lawmaker or your local policymaker. That takes, I think sometimes these really public, contentious environments take a lot of air out of the room, where you can make a lot of headway just creating a relationship with your lawmaker as a subject matter expert that they can rely on and talk to and really engage with when they need information they can trust.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just anything that lets lawmakers not just hear from sort of the 20 angriest people in their inbox, right? I think having sort of informed stakeholders, getting folks who are actually going to benefit from new housing to in some way engage with lawmakers. I think those are all sort of really important strategies to ensure that we're thinking about the greater community good when we think about housing policy, and not the sort of entrenched interests who may not want to see new housing.
Absolutely. Great. Yeah, folks also asked about, sorry, now I lost, about the people with lived experience, including, would you say this is true for engaging people with lived experience of homelessness as well? And you just addressed that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is so important to find ways to engage folks, but not in a way, I think what I want to hesitate from sort of encouraging people to do is like say, oh, anytime we have, a new housing development proposed, let's force the people with lived experience of homelessness to trot out their story at a public meeting, because it shouldn't have to be like that. But I would really love it if we could have a community engagement process that involved planners or local government officials going to either encampments or homeless shelters, or talking with people who are experiencing housing instability, to sort of meet people where they are to learn what kinds of programs would benefit them.
Absolutely. And this is where our Built for Zero leaders can really come in. I facetiously say this. I was a former United States Senate staffer, that we just sit around waiting for people to ask us to go on tours. I say that facetiously, but also it's very true, kind of. And in COVID times, it's different, but there are people in offices whose whole job is just to go out into the community and learn about what's happening, or looking for those great nuggets that they can share with their bosses and their local electeds. And so, like I said, we will be talking about kind of the best practices and how to do this, and really creating that relationship with your lawmaker. So when something comes across their desk, they're like, oh, I know to contact Mandy. She's someone I can trust who has the ground view of this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. One of the things we actually found out in a previous year of the Menino survey, when we asked them about community engagement strategies, they highlighted going out into the neighborhoods as a really effective one. And I think just, as much as we can encourage our local officials to be oriented in that direction, to be like out in the world, meeting people rather than sort of listening to the voices that come to them, is really valuable.
Excellent. I just heard that the secretary is here. So you did a great job filling time. Appreciate it, Katie.
Thanks, everyone.
So yeah, we're going to turn it over to Rosanne, who's going to be introducing our distinguished guest. Thank you, everyone.